Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery preparing to check in on my newest worm bin down here. It's been 14 days since we launched these worms into this system, and at the same time we took a few of those worms. Rather than keep them with the crowd and release them into their new home, we set up a environment that's meant to try to encourage breeding in the worms. So it's a fairly shallow environment with a fairly small number of worms, and it's going to run for a fairly short period of time. But those things were both launched off 14 days ago, and I've not even checked on the new system. I have checked on the breeding bin, because with the breeding bin the idea was that we would come back every so often and give it a little something to eat. But before we can really go headlong into the maintenance of the two new systems, we've got to take care of some unfinished business. And the unfinished business I'm referring to is coming back to their old home. All the worms were pulled out of this horizontal migration feeding zone, but we did find that there were a bunch of worms, some stragglers left behind in the castings. And I came in here a couple nights ago just to aerate the material. I did pull one single worm out of the material, throw it into the collection box, into the bait box. And at this point I'm convinced that it's really just a matter of reuniting these worms that have gathered in this bait box with the rest of the crowd, and this is a done deal. This is a harvestable batch of castings, and this system comes to an end. So I got a couple things to take care of on that vein. Let's get started. So I created this little illustration here, and what we're going to begin with is what's shown up here, which is the breeding bin. And based on everyone's estimate, we averaged everyone's guesses, and it's thought that we've got about 126 worms occupying this system. And I did pop in here a few times since the day they were launched into here 14 days ago. And I added a little bit of food, a little bit of moisture on a couple occasions. And then on the most recent occasion when I came in here, I felt like things were just so damp that I'm not going to add any more moisture. And it even seemed to me like there was some leftover worm chow lingering in the system, so at that time I decided no new food either. All I did was kind of aerate, but today I figured let's go ahead and add a little bit of worm chow, perhaps take a peek under the covers to see how the worms are doing in here. And besides adding a little bit of worm chow, I guess we can make the decision on what to do with moisture. You might have noticed that this is actually one tray resting within another. The whole idea with that was that the lower tray would act as a sump, so that here on top I could be as generous as I want with moisture. I could just pile it in, and if I do go a little bit overboard, then the excess moisture can simply drain out the bottom. So I guess the whole idea behind a breeding environment like this is that you put some mature worms together into an environment where they're not going to feel crowded. And I guess by keeping it kind of shallow, the idea is that the worms coming and going are going to come into contact with one another on numerous occasions, hopefully spurring on some breeding between the wormies. And I think that if you make an assumption that right from the beginning, perhaps worms did already begin mating and meeting and possibly even producing some cocoons, that might have started occurring very soon after they occupied the space. So let's just say 3-4 days, I don't know, whatever the case may be. I'm not sure how long it takes for a cocoon to actually get to the point where the worm can actually drop it off, and then you've got yourself a cocoon that starts into the 21 to 23 days before it hatches. So in my mind, I'm imagining sort of a 4-week span, of which we're about halfway done now, for the worms to meet, mate, leave some cocoons, and then ideally at that point, in most cases, you want to move the breeders away from the environment so that the babies can hatch and take over, and at that point, the breeders are already in some new home without any cocoons or babies in it, continuing with their whole reproduction thing. So right there is all I really wanted to do, but as far as I'm concerned, this system's only about halfway through the process. Next, we're going to go ahead back to the original system, grab the bait box and bring it over here so that those worms that have collected in here can be added to the main system where the majority of the worms were placed 2 weeks ago to launch the new system. And while we're at it, we're going to give the new system a feeding. So let's get that going next. So now here we've got the new system, and I've also got the bait box out of the old system, which we can empty into here and reunite these wormies with the rest of the crowd. But let's see how this new system's coming along. I've popped in to see how the collection of the stragglers and the bait box was coming along. I popped in on the breeding bin to feed it and dampen it, but this system I've not seen since 14 days ago when it was originally launched. So what we're going to find in here is anyone's guess. We did leave some food for them right before we plopped the worms in, and that was positioned right down the center, and the stuff that we got for them for their next feeding number 2, can be seen here. A number of things out of my freezer, as well as a day's worth of coffee. And I guess we're just going to go for a quick inspection of how things look in this system. There is a good bit of moisture pretty much everywhere. You might have noticed that the plastic covering that was on here, the plastic bag, went pretty much edge to edge all the way around, leaving very little room for the system's moisture to escape. And from what I remember, we pretty much thoroughly soaked the bedding in this system even before we decided it was ready for worms to occupy it. And it does seem like a good bit of the moisture that was used to build the systems originally is still here. The stuff we're feeding them is going to bring with it a little bit of moisture, I suppose. These frozen peppers, I guess, will probably bring with them a little bit of moisture. There's a couple pieces of frozen radish there. I'm not sure about how much moisture is going to come out of that stuff. The coffee is not going to contribute much moisture, but I think in the end, the stuff we're adding is probably going to contribute a little bit to the moisture content of the system. Alright, well, from what I remember, the one nice large chunk of food that we left for these little guys was a old bagel positioned right smack in the middle. And we're now actually excavating that portion of the system where the bagel had been placed for them. And I believe right here we're already starting to spot little traces of the leftover bagel. And it's not too surprising that the worms are all over that section of the bin where the food had been left for them. I had pretty thoroughly dampened that bagel, but it was a fair bit of food for them to consume, so I questioned whether we would find leftovers or not, and I guess technically we have, because there's little tiny traces of the bagel remaining here, but certainly not much. It seems like coming back in here 2 weeks later to give them some more food was a pretty good interval, and I'm really glad to see how things look in here. Everything looks pretty happy and healthy, and it certainly seems like the estimate that we came up with in terms of how many worms are occupying the system seems pretty realistic, because this certainly does seem like a really busy worm bin to me, at least. Here's one little guy that I almost missed on my glove there. So let's make sure that little guy is returned to the environment. As you can see, there's tons of bedding in here, but we're going to follow suit with what's best practice, which is to add bedding with your worm bin feedings in most cases. Sometimes when I'm kind of trying to drive a system to completion, I'll hold off on adding any sort of new bedding materials, but other than that, for the most part, adding bedding to the feedings is kind of the routine that I follow in most cases. So we've got peppers, we've got radishes, we've even got the peel of a lemon here. But let's not stop there. We've got some more pastry for these little guys. Once again, as I did with the bagel, when we first launched the system, I've soaked this dried out piece of pastry so that it can hopefully get utilized by the worms pretty quickly as a food substance versus just sitting there and getting moldy and nasty. And I'm going to drop in some grit. The grit that I use in my systems is pulverized eggshell. And I guess the nice bonus for giving them all this coffee here is that in the end we're left with a coffee filter that we could use to mark where we last fed. This will become our lovely feeding zone indicator. So now the worm chow is coming back. The worm chow was what we used to feed the breeder bin. I'm sprinkling a little bit more of that out here onto the coffee that we laid out, because to me it seems like a nice way to dress up a fairly boring pile of coffee by putting a little bit of worm chow on there for them as well. And hopefully they're going to appreciate this yummy feeding over here. So I think the only remaining to-do item over here is to bring in the bait box that we used to round up the stragglers out of their old environment, which is now completely depopulated in my book. And reuniting the wormies that are living in here is our final step. So I did not really poke through here checking it out, but it does seem like it's getting a little bit dry, but that's okay. It looks like we're also bringing with this a little bit of extra bedding for the new system, even though it's got plenty of bedding already. And it just so happens that we used a whole bunch of bedding material here that looks like little worms already. These little pink pieces of old tablecloth that I shredded really makes it tricky to see the worms occupying this material, because the pink strips of paper definitely serve as sort of a camouflage. But I guess at this point the worms that we're releasing are going to be added to the estimate for how many worms occupy this system. So we're going from right here 3,960 to some new number, and that new number is going to be determined by all of us kicking in our ideas for how many worms just got added to that number based on what we're seeing here. The stragglers getting reunited with the rest of the crowd. And a lot of times I have these really dramatic releases of the worms where there's tons of them to be seen and they're really obvious. They're not blending in with a bunch of camouflage. So in this particular case, our release of these worms is pretty, I guess, anticlimactic. I guess that was to be expected. There's certainly not a lot of worms hanging out in this material. But it always does feel good that when you want to write off a batch of material as harvestable and depopulated, it is kind of nice to go through that little extra step of rounding up the stragglers versus leaving them behind, because, well, why not? Doesn't take a whole lot of effort. So I do look forward to hearing everyone's estimates for how many worms we've just added to this new system here. And I think it's fair to assume that we're now probably at or close to 4,000 worms living in here, which is a really nice number. This is going to be a really productive bin. Definitely lots of worms living in here. And the breeder bin will just continue. I'm treating that as sort of halfway through its life cycle, and that's just going to continue as is. As for the old system, now on day 294, I'm officially treating that system as done deal. So the castings can go into storage, the bin can get cleaned out and prepared for its next use. And these little guys, I think they're gonna be a fun system to check in on regularly, because there are a lot of worms in here. So that's it for our check-in, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.